Adaptive reuse simply means outfitting a building to meet present-day needs while retaining its historic character. Ideally, the building should continue to be used for the purpose for which it was initially built to the greatest extent possible. So that a home should ideally continue to be a home, a retail store should continue to be used that way, a church should continue to be used as a church if possible, and so forth. But sometimes it's necessary to actually change the use of a building in order to keep the building in service in order to maintain the building, assuming that the building is not worthy of becoming a museum, and also assuming that there are not the resources in the community to make a building into a museum. So for example, the school building, which is now Academy Hill, a 13-unit condominium association, could no longer be used as a school. When we worked with that building in the 1970s to try to figure out a way to help the building survive, to prevent demolition, we thought of public uses and finally decided that the best use, particularly since it was in a residential neighborhood, would be for residential purposes. In 1973, just a few months after we bought our house and moved to Jonesborough, I joined a small crowd of people standing at the foot of these steps and watched an auctioneer stand on one of the steps and accept bids for this building, which was the old Jonesborough High School, built in 1927 and had been abandoned by the school board in 1972. Charlie Lewis was the high bidder for $25,000 for this old building. His plan was to tear it down and build a motel here. But of course, the building is in the middle of surrounding low-density residential properties, and the nearest zone for commercial use was more than a block away toward the central business district. He therefore went about trying to change the zoning, and one of the groups that he had to go through was the Historic Zoning Commission, who had to approve the demolition of the building. He went before the Historic Zoning Commission 3 times, and according to their guidelines, they had to approve the building to replace this building before they could approve the demolition of this building. Those 3 times, they turned Charlie down, and finally on the 3rd time, when I was there in the meeting, Charlie said, "Well, it's for sale." And I was dumb enough to say, "How much?" And he said, $30,000. And I said, "Sold." And of course I did that intentionally. The room was full of people. I wanted a lot of witnesses to bear witness to the fact that I had agreed to buy it and he had agreed to sell it. He immediately agreed to sell it for $30,000. But of course, as a young man who had just moved to town trying to get settled in our house, I didn't have $30,000. So I went around through the neighborhood and tapped on a few people in Johnson City who were friends of mine, and we put together a group of 15 of us, and we each put in $2,000 to buy the building. Our first goal in the use of the building was to try to find a community use, because after all, it had been built as a school, community use throughout its history. We thought about having the town garage here, nice big parking lot, but that wouldn't have fit very well in a good residential area. We thought about museum space, but the structure has wood floors in it. That wouldn't particularly be good for museum space. Also, the building had large windows, which would make it difficult to control light and heat and air and cooling in the summertime for museum purposes. And besides, it was too big. You know, one thing we may want to do is to go down front to finish the story.
Yeah.
Why don't we do that?
Oh, okay.
A small group of artists leased the building from the group of 15 owners that we had formed and tried to organize here the Sourwood Regional Art Center. The idea was to have visual arts created here, including ceramics, and also to use the school auditorium for plays, for dramas. They worked for about a year and a half and applied for tax-exempt status from IRS. Unfortunately, they received notification that their tax-exempt status had been denied in December 1976. By that time, we realized that they were undergoing some real financial challenges, and we had proceeded to make plans for alternative uses of the building. By that time, we'd come up with the idea of adapting the building for use as a residential condominium association. And so in 1977, we started on a 2.5-year project of converting the building into 13 residential condominium units, which it is today as Academy Hill. We adapted the school building from being used as a school into being used as a residential building. And the reuse, of course, simply means that we continued the life of the building and extended the life of the building by changing its use. Another good example of that in Jonesborough is the adaptation of the old church building that was built as a Christian church in the 1870s to the Parsons Table. It's been used in more recent years as a restaurant. The Parsons Table went through several different stages of use after it was no longer a church. It's my understanding that for a while it was used as a temperance meeting hall in the temperance movement, and then it was later used simply as a cabinet shop. That's when I became acquainted with it, because when I first came to town in 1973, Jimmy Neal Smith had just bought it from the cabinet makers who had used it as a cabinet shop and was converting it into the Parsons Table and doing an adaptive reuse of it as the Parsons Table. Jimmy Neal and I made our friendship and cultivated our friendship that year in 1973 when he was doing that project and I and my family were first moving into town. And he and I both frequently enjoy laughing about the first time that we met, when I simply went up to the Parsons Table and was there when he was there and met him and saw in his trash pile that he was throwing out some antique doors. And I tried to persuade him to save the doors and reuse them because they were an important historic character-defining part of that building, in my opinion. And I don't believe he saved those doors. I'm not sure exactly how that turned out, but there were several other things that he did that changed the building that deviated from its historic character. Some of those were necessary, such as the placement of the kitchen beneath the balcony inside the building. There needed to be room for the kitchen, and there simply was no room to place the kitchen outside the original building. I thought that was a very good adaptive reuse because obviously to be a successful restaurant there had to be a kitchen. But there were changes in the front that we might have been able to figure out a different way of doing them. If you look at the front doors today, they really don't fit the period of 1870s. And maybe someday we'll be able to figure out a way to recapture the style of the 1870s by changing that front to something other than the way it was put in the 1970s. But then there's another interesting thought about that, and that is the question of, has the work done in the 1970s now by 2010 or later become historic in its own right? So that raises a whole additional question of philosophy and historic preservation that we often find ourselves going through, trying to make decisions as to whether to take a building back to an earlier time or accept a later addition as having become historic in itself. Usually what we do with that, at least in this present stage of our thinking, is to raise a couple of questions. First, were the changes that were done, in this case nearly 40 years ago, reasonably appropriate for its time to the style of the building? And how do they fit the original style of the building in our eyes now, some 40 years later, or perhaps later than that? And then the second question that we raise is, how important are those changes as representative of their own time? Not only are they compatible with the original 1870s building, but how important are they for the 1970s and what they represent of the 1970s? And then finally, the third question that's very important, do we have clear documentation of the way the building was before the 1970s changes so that we can do an accurate job of taking it back to the 1870s? And we have examples in Jonesborough in which those questions were answered in various ways, and we made decisions based on the answers to those questions. The May House at 200 West Main Street, a house that is clearly a Greek Revival house, I believe built in the late 1840s, but on which a very elaborate Victorian porch was applied. Now, of course, we wouldn't dream of removing the Victorian porch because it is very important as an example of its period, probably added in the 1870s or 80s, I think more likely in the 1880s. It has taken on a very valuable place in history in itself, even though added to a much earlier house of a much different style. So those two, the house of the late 1840s, if I'm accurate as to when it was built, and the porch added probably in the 1880s, will undoubtedly continue to coexist here in the historic district, at least under our present regulations, indefinitely. We wouldn't think of taking that house back to its original circa 1840s style. And there's another reason for that too, and that is that we don't have a clear documentation as to what was there on the front of that house before the porch was added, the present porch was added.